Racist cop slaps black woman on a private jet. Regrets it minutes later. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the main story. The air was thick with tension as the luxurious private jet soared high above the clouds. Inside, the atmosphere was far from peaceful. James Mitchell, a seasoned cop from a small town in the Midwest, was seated in a plush leather chair, his expression cold and distant. He had just attended an exclusive high-profile event, and the long flight back home was supposed to be his time to unwind. But all of that was about to change. Across from him sat Tasha Williams, a confident, well-dressed woman with an undeniable presence. She had been invited to the event as well, though their paths had never crossed before. Tasha, a successful entrepreneur, was no stranger to the world of high society, but she quickly realized that James wasn't the kind of man she could rely on for any sort of pleasant interaction. From the moment they had boarded, there had been an uncomfortable tension between them. James, for reasons unknown to her, seemed to look at her with a sense of disdain. Tasha did her best to ignore his icy gaze as she settled into her seat, flipping through her phone to check on some business emails. It was when the drinks cart came around that the unease finally erupted. Tasha, having had a long day, politely asked for a glass of wine, her voice calm and steady. James, however, had other plans. He sneered at her request, making a snide comment under his breath that she could barely make out, but enough to send a wave of irritation rushing through her. "I don't think you need that," he muttered, his eyes narrowing. Tasha raised an eyebrow, taking a moment to process his words. She was taken aback, unsure if she had heard him correctly. His comment, laced with judgment, seemed almost like an attempt to belittle her, but instead of lashing out, she decided to remain calm, choosing not to engage with his negativity. After all, they were both adults, and she wasn't about to let anyone ruin her evening. But James, who had been growing more agitated with each passing minute, wasn't done. He kept glancing at her, his gaze sharp and filled with an unspoken challenge. Tasha could feel the tension mounting, but she tried her best to stay composed. That is, until the flight attendant handed her the glass of wine. At that moment, something snapped inside James. Without any warning, he stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger. "You think you're too good for me, don't you?" he barked, his voice rising. Tasha, caught off guard by the sudden outburst, froze in her seat. The last thing she expected was for a situation that had been uncomfortable to suddenly escalate. James's fury was palpable, his body tense, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. And then, in an impulsive act, he slapped her, hard enough to send her head jerking back, her glass of wine spilling across the table. For a moment, there was silence. Tasha's hand instinctively went to her cheek, the sting of his slap lingering as she looked up at him, shocked and speechless. James stood there, breathing heavily, his anger still boiling over. But as the seconds ticked by, something strange happened. His heartbeat began to slow, and the adrenaline that had once fueled his outburst began to fade. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a sense of regret began to creep into his mind. He stood frozen for a moment, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. What had he done? Why had he allowed his emotions to get the best of him? James stood motionless for a moment, his breath heavy in his chest as the reality of what he had just done began to settle in. His hands, still clenched at his sides, trembled slightly. The anger that had surged through him only moments before now felt distant, replaced by a wave of regret that he couldn't shake off. He glanced at Tasha, who was sitting frozen in her seat, her hand pressed against her cheek, her eyes wide in disbelief. The sound of the jet's engines was the only noise that filled the space between them, a stark contrast to the intense silence that followed his outburst. Tasha slowly removed her hand from her face, her eyes still locked on James, but now there was something different in her gaze. It wasn't anger. It was confusion, as if she was trying to understand what had just happened, why it had happened. For a long moment, neither of them moved, both trapped in their own thoughts. James, feeling the weight of his actions bearing down on him, finally spoke. His voice was lower now, quieter, almost as if he was trying to convince himself of something. I don't know what came over me, he muttered, his words coming out in a rush. I didn't mean to. His voice trailed off, and he didn't know how to finish the sentence. What could he possibly say to make sense of what he had done? Tasha remained silent for a moment longer, her expression unreadable. The initial shock had started to fade, replaced by a steely calm. She wasn't going to let this go, but at the same time, she wasn't going to react impulsively. Her upbringing had taught her to pick her battles, and this, as upsetting as it was, wasn't the time to let anger dictate her response. She took a slow breath, her eyes narrowing slightly as she processed what had just happened. Then she spoke. You didn't mean to? She asked, her voice steady but laced with a hint of disbelief. You think it makes it okay? James flinched at her words, but Tasha's tone wasn't harsh. It was simply direct, a reminder that actions have consequences, no matter the intent. No, he replied quietly. It doesn't make it okay. I don't know. I lost control. Tasha let out a small, controlled exhale, staring at him for a long moment. The tension between them was thick, and she could feel the weight of the situation in her chest, but she wasn't about to let him off the hook so easily. Losing control isn't an excuse, she said firmly. Especially not in this situation. The words hung in the air, a powerful reminder of the responsibility that comes with one's actions. James swallowed, the reality of his behavior hitting him harder than before. His mind raced, searching for the right words, the right apology, but nothing seemed adequate. He had crossed the line, and no amount of regret could undo that. Tasha looked at him, her expression softening just slightly, but there was still a coolness in her eyes. She wasn't ready to forgive him. Not yet. You need to think about what you just did, she said quietly, her voice measured. And you need to do better. Her words weren't a plea for him to change immediately. They were a challenge, a reminder that growth comes from acknowledging mistakes and making real effort to be better. James nodded, though he wasn't sure what to say. He was still processing the gravity of his actions. But Tasha's words had struck a chord. It wasn't just about the slap. It was about the anger that had fueled it, the entitlement that had made him think he could behave that way. And for the first time in what felt like forever, James started to question everything he had believed in, his own pride, his own biases, and the way he saw the world. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't awkward, but it was heavy, as if both of them were grappling with something much bigger than just this moment. Finally, Tasha spoke again, her voice softer this time. I'm not going to let you forget this, she said, the weight of her words sinking in. But I hope you learned something from it. James didn't respond, but the sting of her words stayed with him as the jet continued its journey through the night sky. He knew, deep down, that this moment would haunt him for a long time. And perhaps, just perhaps, it would be the wake-up call he needed to change. But only time would tell. The jet continued its smooth glide through the sky, but the tension inside remained thick, like a heavy fog that refused to lift. James sat in his seat, his hands now resting loosely in his lap, but his mind was anything but relaxed. Every passing moment seemed to drag on, each second weighing heavier than the last. He kept replaying the events in his mind, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. The slap, the words, the anger. It was all a blur, but it also felt as though it had been building up for so long. He couldn't shake the feeling of regret that seemed to cling to him like a second skin. He hadn't been proud of the man he was in that moment, and now, more than ever, he realized how much he needed to change. But how? How could he undo the harm he'd caused, the anger he had unleashed so easily? Tasha, on the other hand, was still sitting across from him, her gaze fixed on the small window beside her. The flight had taken on an eerie calm, the earlier storm of emotions now reduced to a quiet stillness. But that didn't mean she was fine. Far from it. While she hadn't let her anger overtake her, She wasn't about to just forget what had happened. Her thoughts were a tangled web of confusion, frustration, and disbelief. She had been caught off guard, shocked by the sheer audacity of James's behavior. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized how deeply rooted the issue was. She wasn't just angry about the slap. It was the entire attitude behind it. The way James had looked at her, as though she was somehow beneath him. The way his words had dripped with contempt. It wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of something much larger, something much more insidious that she knew all too well. She had dealt with it her whole life. It was the kind of thing she could never quite escape, no matter how successful she became, no matter how far she rose in the world. Tasha had learned to navigate the world of high society, to play the game, to hold her head high even when others looked down on her. But James's outburst had been different. This wasn't just a small moment of prejudice. This was something much worse. And yet, in the silence that followed, something had shifted in her as well. Tasha had made the decision not to let this moment define her. She wasn't going to let James's behavior ruin her flight, her day, or her life. But she wasn't going to let him off the hook either. He needed to face the consequences of his actions. As the jet flew on, she closed her eyes for a moment, collecting herself. She was done with being passive, done with letting people walk all over her. She had been fighting battles like this for years, but today this would be a turning point. She would not just let it slide. It wasn't about getting revenge or making him feel bad for what he'd done. It was about standing up for herself, about demanding respect. That was something that James would have to learn, whether he liked it or not. James, still lost in his thoughts, barely noticed the time passing. The silence between them felt like an eternity, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to do something, say something to make things right. He had never been the type to apologize easily, but this was different. He had crossed a line, and the weight of that was too much to ignore. Finally, after what felt like hours, he spoke, his voice tentative, almost fragile. "Tasha, I am sorry for what I did." It was a small statement, but it held more weight than any of his previous words. Tasha didn't look at him immediately, but she heard the sincerity in his voice. She had heard apologies before, some empty, some meaningful, but this one felt different. For the first time since the incident, she allowed herself to meet his eyes. There was no anger in her gaze, only quiet resolve. "Apologies are a start," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But actions speak louder." James nodded, understanding what she meant. He had a long road ahead of him, but this moment, this conversation, was the beginning of something that could change everything. The jet continued its journey, but for both of them, the flight had become more than just a trip home. It had become a moment of reflection, a time to reckon with who they were and what they stood for. And for the first time in a long while, James felt the weight of his actions sink in. It wasn't too late to make a change, but he knew that it would take more than just words to make things right. It would take effort, self-reflection, and time. As the jet glided through the skies, both James and Tasha sat in silence, each deep in their own thoughts. The journey wasn't over yet, but something had already shifted. What would happen next remained uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, James felt the spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, change was possible. "I have no excuse for what I did," James said, his voice still shaky, though now there was something in it, something genuine. "I was wrong. I acted out of anger and judgment, and I shouldn't have. I can't just take back what happened, but I want to make things right." Tasha sat silently across from him, her arms crossed as she watched him. His words weren't empty, but she wasn't sure if this was the start of something real or just another attempt to get out of a difficult situation. She had heard apologies before, many times, but they hadn't always come with the changes that were promised. And for her, actions always spoke louder than words. James shifted in his seat, uncomfortable under the weight of her gaze, but he didn't look away. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't asking for her to forget. He just needed to say what he had been holding in. "I've had moments where I thought I understood people who weren't like me, but I was wrong," he continued, his tone softer now, more thoughtful. I don't know what it's like, what you've been through, what it feels like to be judged just because of who you are. And I see that now. I see how wrong I've been, and I can't change the past, but I can try to do better." Tasha listened, her face still calm, but with a certain warmth beginning to emerge in her eyes. She had spent so much of her life trying to rise above the stereotypes and prejudices others had placed on her. And to hear James acknowledge his mistakes, even just a little, was a small but significant step. "That's a start," she replied quietly, her voice still firm, but now with a note of something softer. "It's not enough just to realize what you've done wrong. It's about showing that you're really going to change, that you're going to make an effort to understand." "I know," James said, nodding slowly. "I know it won't be easy, and I can't fix everything in one day, but I'm willing to put in the work." Tasha didn't respond immediately. She had heard people say things like that before, that they were willing to change. But the real question was always whether they actually followed through. She had learned to protect herself from empty promises, to guard her trust carefully, and yet there was something in James's words that felt different. Maybe it was the sincerity in his eyes, or maybe it was the fact that he hadn't tried to justify his actions. He wasn't looking for her to let him off the hook, and that made a difference. The flight continued on, and the time passed in relative quiet. Tasha turned her attention back to the window, watching the world below them as the clouds rolled past. She had nothing to say for now. Her mind was still processing everything: the slap, the apology, the change she had yet to see in James. But one thing was certain. This moment, this encounter, wasn't just something that would fade away. It would stick with her just as it would stick with him. James, on the other hand, felt a growing sense of unease as the silence stretched on. He knew he had a long road ahead of him. He couldn't just walk away from this, not now. He had started something by confronting his actions, by acknowledging what he had done, but the real test would come after. Would he truly be able to change, to grow beyond the person he had been? He wasn't sure yet, but there was a flicker of hope in him now that he hadn't felt in a long time. The journey wasn't just about the destination anymore. It was about the work that would come after, the work of becoming someone better, someone more aware, someone who could truly make a difference. As the jet flew onward, the two of them sat quietly, each lost in their own thoughts. The night had grown darker outside, but there was a faint light within them both, a recognition that change, while difficult, was possible. It was just a matter of taking the first step, and maybe, just maybe, this was that first step. "I have to be honest," James said, breaking the silence that had settled over them for the past several minutes. His voice was calm, but carried a heaviness that matched the mood inside the jet. "I'm not sure what I was expecting, but I know that I can't just go back to being the same person I was before. Not after all of this." Tasha glanced at him, her expression unreadable. It wasn't that she hadn't heard. People say similar things before, but the sincerity in his voice made her pause. She had learned over the years to be cautious, to guard herself against empty words. But there was something in James's demeanor that made her think he might actually be serious. The plane hummed steadily, the outside world a blur of clouds and night. But inside the cabin, it felt like they were suspended in time. Tasha wasn't sure how much she believed James just yet, but she couldn't deny the fact that something had changed in him. Whether it was enough to lead to real change, that remained to be seen. "I know that words aren't enough," he continued, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that surprised her. "But I want to prove that I can do better. Not just to you, but to everyone around me. It's something I'm going to have to work at, but I'm ready to do that work." Tasha considered his words carefully. She had learned that actions, not words, were the true measure of change. People could promise anything, but it was the follow-through that mattered. And as much as she wanted to believe him, she couldn't just let herself be swept up in a moment of fleeting remorse. "We'll see," she said finally, her voice calm but resolute. "I'm not saying I believe you yet, but I'm willing to see where this goes." James nodded slowly, understanding her hesitation. He had given her no reason to trust him before, and he didn't expect her to just hand that trust over. This was something that would have to be earned. "Fair enough," he said quietly. The rest of the flight passed in relative silence, the two of them lost in their own thoughts. "Tasha, while still wary, couldn't help but feel that something had shifted, not just between her and James, but within herself as well. She wasn't sure where this moment would lead, but she did know one thing. She wasn't going to let it go easily. Change didn't come without struggle, and she wasn't going to let anyone, including herself, settle for anything less than true growth. James, for his part, found his mind constantly returning to what had happened. The slap, his anger, the way he had viewed Tasha and so many others like her. It wasn't enough for him to just apologize. He knew that real change meant dismantling the prejudices that had been ingrained in him over the years. And that wasn't something that could happen overnight. But as he sat there, quietly contemplating, he realized that he was ready for that journey. For the first time, he saw a path ahead of him that wasn't just about avoiding the consequences of his actions. It was about becoming someone better, someone who truly understood what it meant to be fair and just. He wasn't sure where that path would lead, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like it was worth following. As the jet continued its journey through the night, the two of them sat in silence, each caught up in their own reflections. Tasha wasn't sure what would happen next, but one thing was certain. The encounter on this plane, this shared moment of reckoning, would stay with both of them long after the flight was over. It was a small step, but sometimes the smallest steps were the ones that led to the greatest changes. The plane touched down smoothly, its wheels making a soft thud against the tarmac as the flight came to an end. The usual bustling of the airport seemed distant, almost like it was happening in another world. Inside the jet, James and Tasha remained in their seats, both lost in their thoughts. The journey they had shared had been a quiet one, but had been far from uneventful. For James, the past few hours had been a revelation. He had spent much of his life believing that he knew who he was, that he understood the world around him. But that belief had been shattered, and he found himself questioning everything he thought he knew. His conversation with Tasha had opened his eyes to the reality of his own biases, and while he didn't know exactly how to move forward, he was determined to try. As the seatbelt sign flickered off, signaling the end of the flight, James took a deep breath. He knew he had a lot of work ahead of him. Change wasn't going to come easily, but he had taken the first step by acknowledging the mistakes he had made. It was a small step, but it was the beginning of something he hoped would be meaningful. Tasha, meanwhile, was still processing everything she had come into this flight with her own assumptions, her own guardedness. She had learned to protect herself from people like James, people who thought they understood everything, people who judge her based on what they saw on the surface. But somewhere in the course of the flight, something had shifted. James had surprised her, not with grand gestures or empty promises, but with a simple acknowledgement of his own shortcomings. It wasn't enough for her to trust him completely, but it was a start. As the jet slowed to a stop and the flight crew began preparing for their exit, Tasha finally spoke again. "This doesn't change everything," she said, her voice steady, but not unkind. "But it's a start. I hope you really do the work. Not just for me, but for everyone." James nodded, his gaze softening. "I will," he replied, his voice filled with a quiet resolve. Tasha didn't respond immediately, but her eyes met his for a brief moment, a flicker of something between them. Maybe respect, maybe acknowledgement. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something. The sound of the cabin door opening interrupted their quiet moment, and the crew began to file out, guiding passengers toward the exit. Tasha stood up first, straightening her jacket. She didn't look back at James as she made her way to the door, but she felt a sense of clarity she hadn't had before. She wasn't expecting miracles, and she wasn't going to give her trust easily. But today had shown her that people could change, even if it was a slow, painful process. James followed behind, standing a little taller than before. The weight of his own reflection was still heavy on his shoulders, but there was a faint sense of purpose in his steps now. As they walked off the plane and into the terminal, the bright lights of the airport greeted them. The world outside was waiting, as it always was, but for the first time in a long while, James felt like he was ready to face it. Tasha had already moved ahead, her figure becoming a blur in the distance. But James wasn't in a rush. He knew that change didn't come with haste. It came with time, effort, and a willingness to confront the uncomfortable truths about oneself. As he walked through the airport, James didn't know what the future would hold. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. It wasn't a path that would be easy, but it was one that he was willing to take. Tasha, too, was walking her own path, one of resilience and strength. And while their paths had crossed in an unexpected and difficult way, the experience had given them both something important, a reminder that the journey of change, however slow, was always worth taking. The weeks following their flight were a blur of everyday life for both James and Tasha. Life had a way of moving forward, regardless of the inner transformations they were trying to navigate. For James, the weight of that conversation on the jet remained in the back of his mind every day. He knew that what had happened between him and Tasha wasn't just a one-time incident. It was a mirror, reflecting parts of himself that he had been blind to for far too long. The anger, the judgment, the assumptions, they had been a part of him, whether he wanted to admit it or not. But now it was all he could think about. He found himself questioning his behavior, his past actions, his interactions with others. It wasn't easy to face, but he knew it was necessary. Every day, he worked to be more mindful, more patient, and more open to understanding the perspectives of people who were different from him. He started listening more, not just waiting for his turn to speak, but really hearing what others had to say. At work, he noticed the small, almost invisible ways in which his old biases had affected how he treated people. He began to change how he interacted with colleagues, particularly those from marginalized communities, realizing that his old habits needed to be replaced with new ones. It wasn't a perfect transformation. There were days when he slipped, when the old anger would flare up, but he didn't let that stop him. Each time, he reminded himself that change was a process, and he was committed to making it happen. Tasha, on the other hand, was also going through her own quiet evolution. The flight with James had left her with a sense of cautious optimism. She had seen something in him that she hadn't expected, the possibility of change. But she also knew that change took time, and she wasn't ready to throw herself into a friendship or even an acquaintance with him just yet. She had built her life around being cautious, around protecting herself from people who could hurt her. It wasn't easy for her to open up, and it certainly wasn't easy for her to forgive. But she was starting to think that perhaps there was room for growth in herself as well. Her business had been thriving, and she had been more focused than ever on expanding her brand, on breaking down the barriers that had once held her back. But she also started to realize that there were emotional walls she had built up over the years, walls that had kept her isolated. Maybe it was time to tear some of them down. She wasn't sure what that would look like, but she was beginning to entertain the idea of letting go of her guardedness, just a little. She wasn't about to forget what had happened on the plane, but she was starting to see that people could grow, and she could too. Weeks turned into months, and neither James nor Tasha forgot that moment they shared on the jet. It remained in their minds, a reminder of the complexities of human behavior, of how difficult and yet how necessary it was to confront one's flaws. One afternoon, months later, they ran into each other at a charity event that neither had planned to attend. The awkwardness was immediate, a strange tension in the air as they both saw each other from across the room. Tasha's first instinct was to turn away, but something stopped her. Maybe it was the thought of how much they had both changed, or maybe it was the curiosity about how James had been evolving. She took a deep breath and walked over. "It's been a while," she said, her voice measured but not unkind. James looked up, surprised to see her there. A small smile played at the corner of his mouth, and he extended a hand. "It has," he said, his tone genuine. "I've been thinking about our conversation a lot." Tasha nodded, not sure what to say next. It wasn't like they were suddenly best friends, but the distance between them had shrunk a little. "I'm glad to hear that," she said simply. And for a brief moment, in that quiet exchange, it felt like a new beginning, not a perfect one, but a step towards something better. They didn't need to say more. The path they had started on, though long and winding, had given them both something they hadn't expected: hope. Not a perfect, neat hope, but the kind that grew quietly day by day in the spaces between old habits and new actions. Months had passed since that chance encounter at the charity event, and both James and Tasha had continued on their respective paths. Life had moved on, but the change within them was subtle yet undeniable. James had kept his promise to himself, working daily to dismantle the biases he had carried for so long. He continued to reflect on his past actions, using every opportunity to improve how he interacted with others, especially those from different backgrounds. His colleagues had noticed a shift in him, and although there was still skepticism from some, there was also a newfound respect. He wasn't perfect, and he knew that, but he had begun to understand the importance of humility and listening. He wasn't trying to be a saint. He just wanted to be a better man, someone who could make a positive difference, however small it might be. He had become involved in community outreach programs, volunteering at local organizations aimed at supporting marginalized communities. It wasn't about earning forgiveness from anyone. It was about doing the right thing, even if no one was watching. Tasha, too, had found herself growing in ways she hadn't expected. Her business had flourished, and she was more confident than ever in her career. But beyond the professional success, she had begun to peel back the layers of herself that she had kept hidden for so long. She realized that while she had worked hard to protect herself from the world, there were parts of her own vulnerability she had neglected. She wasn't sure how to bridge that gap yet, but she had started to allow herself to be open to new relationships, new connections. Not every person she met was someone she could trust right away, but she was learning to take small steps in opening her heart, in allowing people to see her for who she truly was, beyond the protective wall she had built over the years. One afternoon, as Tasha was heading to a meeting, she received a message from James. He was reaching out, not for a grand gesture, but simply to check in to see how she was doing. She hadn't expected it, but as she read his message, a warmth spread through her. It wasn't about forgiveness or even friendship just yet. It was about acknowledging that both of them had been on a journey since their first encounter, and that journey was still unfolding. She thought about it for a moment before typing her reply. "I'm doing well. How about you?" Her response was simple, but it felt like a bridge, however small, between them. James's reply came quickly. "Better, every day. I'm still working on myself, but I think I'm heading in the right direction." Tasha smiled as she read his words. It wasn't a promise of immediate change, but it was something real, something grounded in effort and honesty. "I'm glad to hear that," she wrote back, feeling the truth in his words. "Keep going. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it does happen." There was a brief pause before his reply came. "Thanks. I appreciate you." It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was a moment of acknowledgement, a quiet recognition that both of them were still trying, still learning, still moving forward. The next few weeks were filled with more messages, more small interactions that didn't erase the past, but began to build a new foundation. James and Tasha weren't suddenly close friends, and they didn't need to be. What had started as an uncomfortable and painful encounter had, over time, turned into a shared understanding, a recognition that change was possible, even if it took time, and that growth, though difficult, was worth pursuing. They weren't where they had hoped to be, not yet, but they were both on a path that led somewhere better. Life would continue to throw challenges their way, but for the first time, they both felt a sense of hope that they could face those challenges with a newfound awareness, a sense of purpose that came from within. It wasn't about perfection. It was about progress. It had been nearly a year since that fateful flight, and both James and Tasha had continued to live their lives, changed but still very much themselves. Their paths hadn't crossed much during that time, but the ripples of that brief interaction had stayed with them. James, now more aware of his own biases, had worked hard to maintain the promise he had made to himself. Every day, he tried to be better, and though he knew it wasn't always easy, he had come to understand that real growth came from a willingness to face uncomfortable truths. He had stayed involved in his community, volunteering and learning from those who had experiences vastly different from his own. His colleagues noticed the change in him, and many had even started to approach him with more respect. But it wasn't the recognition from others that mattered most to James. It was the internal shift he felt every time he challenged his old assumptions. He had learned to pause before reacting, to listen before speaking, and to understand before making judgments. Tasha, on the other hand, had continued to thrive in her career. Her business had expanded, and she was gaining the recognition she had long worked for. But it wasn't just her professional success that had shaped her over the past year. She had become more open, not just to new opportunities, but to new relationships. She had learned to trust a little more, to open up in ways she hadn't thought possible before. The walls she had built around herself were still there, but they were no longer as impenetrable as they once were. She was letting people in slowly, cautiously, and with the knowledge that vulnerability didn't have to equate to weakness. One afternoon, she found herself at a conference for businesswomen, an event she had attended many times before, but this time it felt different. As she walked into the room, her eyes scanned the crowd, noting familiar faces and new ones alike. But then, her gaze landed on someone she hadn't expected to see. James. He was standing near the back of the room, chatting with a group of people. Tasha hesitated for a moment, wondering if she should approach him or simply move on. But she remembered how far both of them had come in the past year, and how their brief moments of connection had stayed with her. She took a deep breath and walked toward him. James saw her before she saw him. He smiled when their eyes met, and there was a warmth in his expression that wasn't just polite. "Tasha," he said, stepping forward. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Neither did I," she replied, her tone light, though there was an undercurrent of sincerity. "I wasn't planning on attending, but I'm glad I did." They exchanged pleasantries for a moment, talking about the event and the speakers. There was no awkwardness between them, no tension, just a comfortable exchange between two people who had both evolved in different ways. Eventually, their conversation drifted toward more personal matters. "It's good to see you again," James said, his voice a little more serious now. "I've thought about our conversation a lot, and I just want to say that I'm still working on everything we talked about." Tasha nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I know," she said. "I've seen the effort. It's not about perfection, James. It's about the work you put in every day. And I will keep putting that work in," he replied, his voice steady. "It's not easy, but I've learned that it's the only way forward." Tasha smiled. "I believe you," she said simply. "We're all on our own journeys. And sometimes, those journeys take unexpected turns." They shared a quiet moment, both acknowledging the path that had brought them here. It wasn't just about forgiving or forgetting what had happened. It was about recognizing that people could change, that growth was a constant process, and that the journey wasn't linear. As they continued to talk, it became clear that while they weren't yet close friends, there was a mutual respect that had formed between them. It wasn't something that had been forced. It had developed naturally over time. And for the first time, Tasha felt like she could look at James not as the man who had once hurt her, but as someone who was genuinely trying to be better. And for James, it was the first time he felt like he had earned that respect. The event continued around them, but for James and Tasha, this moment was theirs. A quiet understanding had formed between them, an acknowledgement that while they weren't perfect, they were both on the path to becoming the people they had always wanted to be. The past might never fully disappear, but it didn't have to define them anymore. They could move forward, side by side, not as strangers, but as people who had learned to grow, to change, and to trust in the possibility of redemption.